Hi everyone, welcome back to the CyberPod for another episode with Kash and Tarek. And in today's episode, it's all about threats and threat actor groups. Bit more juicy than the last one.
Definitely a juicier one than DPA. And I see you've got a brighter top on, which is not a nice change
represent
from the
Brighton a little bit more.
dog
know.
way.
A little jazzier lifestyle. Yeah, how it is.
Nice. So yeah, today we'll talk about different threat actor groups. And if you are in the know or you read about threat intelligence, depending on where you are, you may see them being called different things. But we'll give you a high-level introduction to who they are, because these are likely to be the people that are attacking or behind an attack on your system, whether it's an automated thing or a targeted attack.
Yeah, so there's 5 sort of key categories here, right? So if we start with the first one, it's the APT groups, the Advanced Persistent Threat Groups, or nation-state actors. And if you're not in the cyberspace, this is probably the first thing you think of. You think of, like, from the movies, right? You think of
James
that.
Bond.
Yeah, the James Bond scenario. It's a nation-state actor. They're being paid by, a nefarious government. And, they've got this crazy setup and they've recruited an ex-hacker to go and work for the government. And
Who hacks in within 30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds, they're in there, and amazing, right? But it's that scenario, right, where there's some sort of political or nation-state interest at play here, right? So that's what's driving the motivation for this group. And because of that, they're likely to have more funding than other areas because, they have those interests at heart. And so because of that, it's probably the one people take the most seriously in terms of
most resource, most funding. They have teams of people.
So if you think an APT group's targeting you, you're going to take that seriously.
Yeah, and they're probably going to succeed. So.
The problem is a lot of people dismiss them. If you work for, government, critical national infrastructure, that kind of thing, you're going to assume that APT groups are going to be targeting you. Whereas if you're lower down the food chain, maybe you're in the financial services sector, or you work for a healthcare organization, you're thinking, well,
financial services maybe, but I think my friend in media definitely
dismissed it, right?
Will be dismissing them.
Yeah,
for good reason.
Yeah, they'd say, well, why would they target us? There's juicier targets than us to go for. But at the end of the day, if you're processing a significant amount of personal data for people, or you have something of value to another nation, you might come into question for them. And once they start targeting you, they've got significant resources to come after you. Right?
Box accounting, you're most likely safe from nation-state actors. That's an in-joke for anybody who watched our previous episode where box accounting was a made-up company name.
Yeah, apologies, box accounting. If you're in the comments, I'm so sorry.
Real company
Your share prices have gone through.
I doubt we have that much pull. But it's nice to imagine.
Yeah. We live in a good world.
But giving a couple of examples then of nation-state actors. A few years ago, you may have heard about the 100 million that was stolen from a Bangladeshi bank. That was North Korean state actors just funding their government. There's a lot of financial gain with North Koreans especially because hacking is one of the ways they make their money with all the countries that have put
like
sanctions on them. Yeah. And then we also have things like the Russia-Ukraine situation. Before it turned into a war, it was a cyber war. So NotPetya is a good example of ransomware. Well, you call it ransomware, but it didn't have the recovery feature. Its sole purpose was to destroy. And that was attributed to a Russian state-sponsored group by people, companies like Google and other well-known organizations.
Yeah. So in that scenario, they're not actually after, some financial gain. They're not after anything in particular. They just want to cause some disruption and wreak some havoc and
take down national infrastructure.
Yeah, and it can be quite devastating in that scenario. Then we move into the second group, so the OCNs, or organised crime groups. These ones people are more familiar with because they're the easiest group to understand, right, when it comes to their motivations. primarily financials,
Money.
right? Money talks. So you're a criminal group. You've got, some sort of organization about you. You're not just a guy in his basement. You've got, some sort of hierarchy and resources behind you backing it up. And so you're targeting things worth value to you. And again, when we talk about this, it doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be money they're after, but money is usually something that they're after in that case. But often it's data. It can actually be quite valuable. So there's a lot of scenarios. I mean, one of my first roles was finding exposed data in open sources across the internet. So looking in marketplaces and forums, and particularly like payment card details that had been leaked. That's a big money earner, right? If you can go in, identify a load of payment cards from a payment processing provider or a bank, that's quite juicy.
Yeah.
You can make some good money out of that.
Yeah, a dark web marketplace basically looks like eBay, but full of payment card information.
Yeah.
Or other services that you can buy.
Yeah, and it's a really easy one for people to go, because then if you're the customer for that, you're looking for a payment card that you can use to buy, use, and find out what sort of limits on there. So you use your imagination for what you can do with that. So, whilst they're an easy group to understand in terms of their motivation, again similar to APT groups, they kind of get dismissed a little bit, especially in the SME space. Especially if you're not a juicy company, not a particularly in the public eye, you think, are they going to be after us? Are they going to target us?
It's unlikely.
Yeah. And that's where, when we talk about like the threat actor groups, it's always key to actually map it to your business, right? It's no point saying, right, okay, we need to look at all 5 in all equal detail, because
and even within these, you have different groups that target different sectors. So even if you are a bank or a government, you only are interested in groups, nation state groups that target your sector.
Yeah.
You're going to dismiss the ones that target
other nations.
A good example that comes to mind is Sony probably dismissed nation state actors until they released what was that movie, the comedy with James Franco.
The Interview.
The Interview. And then they were hacked and their films were leaked pre-release by a North Korean,
and that'll hit you right in the financial pocket. So it's a difficult one to take. But I think at the end of the day, criminals want to make money, right? So if you have assets that are valuable, and someone can do a bit of recon on you, identify that your security isn't very good, there's potential easy to exploit vulnerabilities, the reward to effort rating goes up quite high.
Yeah, and sometimes they won't be targeted attacks, right?
Yeah.
So if there's a vulnerability that's well known, that's affecting a lot of different companies and organizations, and this is where small business may be hit by an OCN or organized crime network, they are just going after a vulnerability and they're automating attacks against that vulnerability rather than saying we want to target this organization or this sector. So make sure you have your hygiene and in place, especially patching regular updates to your systems.
Yeah, anyone that sits within some sort of endpoint team or network team that actually looks at their logs, has their logs switched on, will be able to see that a lot of their public-facing endpoints are constantly being scanned. They're constantly being poked by these automated scanners to go, any vulnerabilities you got in there? Have you got any issues? And if you've got a nice, easy to exploit one, well, that's quite an easy win for us there.
Yeah. That's regardless of size. There's automated scans. They don't care who you are, what your size is. They're just out there scanning and sending back results and looking for easy ways in. But back to OCNs, a good example comes to mind, and this is a hybrid one. It was a nation state actor working with an organized crime network, Lazarus Group. They're a North Korean group, and they used an OCN with their network of people as money mules to go to cash points, put in cards and take money out from these cash points. So that was where a nation state group and
So there's like some crossover. You know?
an organized crime network worked together. I think they messaged each other via some dark web forums and potentially instant messaging. Telegram gets a lot of bad press. I'm thinking they were involved in this.
Telegram and Discord are usually the ones that get thrown in there. Yeah.
But I'm not sure if it was Telegram or if it was just a dark web forum where they exchanged messages. But the organized crime network boss was tracked down and found, and it turned out it was all linked to the Lazarus group, who were the masterminds behind this, whereas the organized crime network was the muscle and the manpower to go and get the money from these banks. It was millions collected across the world within minutes of each other. It was a great, huge operation, but credit to them, it was really well done.
Yeah. Next into group number 3, it's all about hacktivists, a group that is definitely growing in terms of their appreciation and their threat rating. As you can see, in cyber, people aren't particularly creative. So when it comes to naming conventions, people thought, right, how do we talk about activists in the cyber world? Let's call them hacktivists. Cash money.
Yeah, it works.
Perfect. Right. Now, activism isn't a new threat, right? This has been going on for centuries. And as we've seen over the past few years, it doesn't just affect the organization or the entity in question, right? So, for example, you do something wrong. It doesn't necessarily just mean that you're a target, that people might identify a link between us. And then all of a sudden I start getting some heat for it. I'm like, well, what did I do?
Yeah. And in my threat intelligence days, monitoring some activist groups was part of my job.
Yeah, and I think it's a really juicy one, because despite being a hacktivist and it's in the cyber world, it doesn't always stay there. With the other groups, like you said, it's very much designed around cyber attacks. So how can we conduct a cyber operation against an entity? But the thing with a hacktivist is the principle is activism at heart. So often what people can do is use cyber techniques to obtain information that they can then use in the physical world. So there are a lot of features within applications and websites and services that you can use to like geolocate people, right? So you can identify potentially where a high value CEO might live, and all of a sudden you get made redundant from your job, or something's controversial is happening with that, which is what your bread and butter, really. Yeah.
And on the website of things, if you get big enough and you do enough stunts, you get the likes of Anonymous behind you, who are not one big group. They're more like a collective of smaller groups, people coming together behind the brand Anonymous. And you can suffer from a DDoS, which is just denial of service types attack, is probably their most common attack there. But you can suffer from your services being taken down online because you're the victim of hacktivists.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to reinforce that message of, look, activism happens, and it's always existed, it will always exist, but actually putting a screen in front of people gives them a bit more confidence and freedom of, well, I'm not necessarily going to get caught by a camera here, or I'm not going to get spotted in a physical location. I can do some research and do some digging around on like open sources of intelligence and identify some quite useful information. And I don't necessarily have to go to that physical location and do something. I can just post that physical location on a social media site, on a forum, and let somebody else do the dirty work for
And sometimes it's just reputational damage, right? One TikTok or Instagram post or reel, even Facebook for the older people, generation in their 30s and above.
MySpace
like
in
myself.
there at all? Or?
Oh no, probably not MySpace. And not even I use that anymore. I doubt. Does that still exist?
I'm sure it will. I remember trying to log back into my what was it? some of my old instant messaging platforms, and half of them were blocked, half of them still weren't accessible. So yeah, I'd be amazed to see if I still had a few profiles digging around.
But yeah, they now with social media, the power of going viral and getting your message all across the world, almost instantly, it's huge, and it's a potential business reputational risk for a business, which can start off other forms of activism against yourself.
Yeah, I think the biggest example of this at the moment is on Twitter, or X, if you want to call it that. I still call it Twitter. I refuse to call it X. But there's the really good feature of community notes, which are designed to call out fake news and to call out pure lies on the platform. The problem is that they don't always come in that quickly. So, there's a time to life for some of this fake information. And if it gets spread around enough and enough, that can be pretty well known before somebody community notes it, right? So it's being aware that it doesn't necessarily have to be true information that's being spread about you. It's if somebody has a particular agenda against your organization, they will use techniques to muddy your image and to gain a following against you, and that can spread pretty quickly. So yeah, it's a real area of growing concern, I would say.
I think this is something that small businesses do need to be aware of, whereas the OCN and the nation state actors, the APTs, not really a concern.
More at the top,
but this hacktivism and what we're talking about next is where I think our listeners and the small business community does need to be aware.
Yeah, definitely. Well, then if we move into number 4, right? So we have the probably the funniest name. I think it's probably the one that's most difficult to name because it just doesn't have a formal name for it yet, right? So I've seen it called Script Kiddies. I've seen it called Thrill Seekers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, Script Kiddies is probably the most common one. But the thing is, call them kiddies because it's almost abusing how bad they are. But you get some really, really smart people who have a lot of skill and expertise in this area, who may even do it as a day job to help companies protect themselves or work for a nation state actor as the day job. But then they like to mess about and test their skills from their bedroom at home. And that's when they also fall into this Script Kiddie title.
Yeah, and I think you have scenario, or you have services like Hack the Box, right, where people that want to become like a penetration tester who can do legal hacking under certain conditions can test out and hone their skills on fake infrastructure. The problem is sometimes that can get boring for people, particularly the more skilled you get, and people get curious.
Yeah, and there's no risk and there's no thrill.
Yeah. What am I doing here?
If you want to abuse a hacker in your network, call them a Script Kiddie. I'm pretty sure they will not like that.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with the name Script Kiddie is it downplays the potential level of skill, like you said. And being in the public domain, you're automatically a potential target for a Script Kiddie because you have something that is of value to them. They're not necessarily after your money or after your data or after anything like that. They're after...
They may be in some cases, but
they're more likely to stumble across it and go, oh, that's actually quite valuable. I might use it. The starting point is probably, can I?
Yep.
Did anything happen? It looks like I didn't get picked up on the logs. Nothing. I didn't get blocked when I made 1,000 requests.
They may be a customer of your own service and they're like, oh, I use the service. Let me see if I can break into it.
Yeah. And... it's something that I think you have to be wary of because the further someone gets, natural inquisition takes place, right? So you might have started as, oh, let's see if I can, sign into this website without having an account there. Oh, I'm inside it. Oh, let's see if I can get admin privileges in here. And once I've got that, oh, let me see if I can log in here. And the further they get without being detected and that an alarm going off, the more they're going to try stuff out.
Right.
So
the TalkTalk hack, was it 2015?
Yeah,
it's a while ago now, but that was two 15-year-olds.
Yeah, exactly.
In their bedroom, just playing around, and they came across infrastructure that TalkTalk didn't know they had, called Shadow IT, something we'll touch on.
Yeah.
In the future.
Yeah, I think it's something that, like I said, people are easy to dismiss, but I think is a threat to every public-facing entity, right?
But I have a fun example here, a short story from my threat intelligence days.
Always good.
um, One of our clients had an incident. They had some data that was on the web somehow, and they'd been contacted by this hacker, gave his hacker name, and said, I have this data, and he'd given a snippet of the data to prove it was real.
Yeah.
The client were nervous because the data was genuine. It belonged to a few of their clients. So they reached out to my organization, the managed service provider who's providing threat intel services to them. I went around, did a lot of digging over a couple of days. We found the person's social media profiles, and on there we found pictures of him. We knew what he looked like, what his kids looked like, where he lived, his interest in motorcycles, which was quite a lot, and everything was linked back to him and his address, which was handed over to the organisation. They'd turned it into a police case and was handed over to the police. So at some point in the near future, he would have had probably not a knock, a boot on his front door at
polite tap on the door at a reasonable
at
hour.
4 a.m. in the morning. But yeah, in that instance, we did manage to track them down. But in most cases, is unfortunately, if they cover their tracks well, it's very difficult to attribute an attack to somebody. And in this instance, it wasn't a hack. It was just a third party that had accidentally uploaded some data onto a public website that shouldn't have been there. They took it down quite quickly, but obviously this person had managed to download it before it was taken down.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, and that leads us nicely onto the next one.
Yeah, I mean number 5, and it's probably the one people feel most uncomfortable talking about, but it's the insider threat, right? And it's people don't want to.
Well, it's the term threat as well, right?
Yeah,
it's not just they are being malicious. Like
yeah.
the example I just gave when I said it goes on nicely is because that was an insider threat. Somebody accidentally posting information online.
Yeah.
But you've just had a breach. That's your insider threat.
Exactly. And I think it's number 5, but you could call it 5A and 5B, right? Because half of it is the malicious side of things, right? You've got a disgruntled employee. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe they didn't get the promotion that they wanted. I mean, I think if you talk to most people, particularly in this country, they're going to say that they've got a problem at work, whether it's with their boss, with someone in their team.
The fact that they have to wake up in the morning.
The fact that they have to work is probably the main issue that they have. But ultimately, most people aren't happy in their jobs, and it doesn't take a lot to tip somebody over the edge. And what senior people in organizations sometimes fail to realize is a lot of people know a lot more than they let on, right? Particularly in customer facing roles or internal facing roles, so admin, HR kind of roles, have access to a lot of information, right? They can see a lot of data that is potentially quite sensitive.
Yeah, your call center person has access to all your clients' details.
Yeah, but you would automatically assume that that's fine. They work for the company, their interests are aligned to us. We pay them a salary every month. It's going to be fine, right? But if you're disgruntled, you might go and do something yourself. You might be approached by someone who wants to take down the organization or wants to do something and says, here's a nice reward for you to be our inside man or to be our inside person in that scenario. So I think that first scenario is all about the malicious side of things. So a disgruntled employee wanting to take action against their company because of, an issue that they're having.
Or for financial gain.
Right? People spot an opportunity. People say, okay, I can make a bit of money here and it's going to be quite easy. And I know that the logging's not switched on. I'm not going to get caught. If you need a better reason to turn on logs, it's that people in the security team will be fully aware that there is no way to attribute blame to anyone. So that is probably the best reason you have to switch logs on, right? Then the other side of things when it comes to the insider threat is all about the inadvertent side of things. And this is what's more common, right? Because it's people doing things without realizing that it's actually caused an issue. So they might upload something, they might change something. When we saw recently that somebody changed something within CrowdStrike and affected millions of people around the world, because it wasn't malicious, it wasn't a cyber attack, but it was a significant cyber issue for people, or significant issue because of a accidental change. Now that would be classed as an insider threat, right? It's not a malicious entity. It's not a nation state actor going, right, let's take them down.
CrowdStrike would call it an insider threat. Everyone else would call it a supply chain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which gets a bit blurry. Sorry, guys, getting into a technicality.
But ultimately, it's that thing of, well,
user error.
We have so many applications, websites, web servers, everything that, is constantly up and running, and things are being changed constantly. Someone's adding more functionality. But it's not even
by mistake, right? So let's say you're working at a job and you've created a document for that company. It'll come in handy in your next role, and you save it on your local drive or email it to yourself. You're not doing it.
Absolutely never done that before in my life, and I reject
anyone
the allegation.
Ever taken any work with them from a previous company to the next company. But if somebody does that, there's obviously people out there that might do something like that. They're not doing it from a malicious reason. They're thinking, hey, I put in the effort, I created the document.
I wrote it,
Or even if they didn't write it, they're like, oh, it's just a process that I'm taking. It's not a PII data. It's not like I'm stealing their client information. I'm just standing like, I'm taking from a SOC point of view or security operations point of view. Oh, I took the incident response playbook. Not saying I did, but as an example of something that someone in my field may do, because you can reuse that everywhere you go. Or information security policy, written once and reused many times. Copy paste edit now, and it's ready to go within an hour instead of spending a whole day or a few days creating something from scratch. That's not malicious. And that's not accidental. You're doing it on purpose, but people don't even realize what they're doing right there is considered an insider threat, and it's something they're not allowed to do.
Yeah, I think the important aspect to consider now within the insider threat space, particularly in that inadvertent side of things. So you mentioned earlier about, you can see some crossover between some of the groups. You can see a nation state potentially team up with an organized crime network. A insider threat might not be the whole story, but it might be the first block in that story. So they open the door to...
Or it's your way to detect something is happening. So, for example, you're probably going down this route. A hacktivist group has somebody who's involved in the group, but now they're an insider and they let the group in. Or an organized crime network has approached somebody in your business, paid them, and now they're an insider threat to you.
Or someone's just made a change.
They've been compromised, and now you've got compromised incident. But if you don't have insider threat monitoring in place, how do you detect that account being misused?
Yeah, exactly.
So again, that's going into the details of security operations that we don't want to touch on in this episode, but it's definitely things to consider.
Yeah, as you can tell, threat actor groups versus, data protection and regulation, you can see where our, enjoyment and focus is, right? This is a lot more of a juicy topic, right? I'm sure we'll zero back to it. Any juicy examples you've got for an insider threat scenario?
I've mentioned one already, but I think another one that comes to mind was a director who left an organization, and there was quite a few mistakes made by the company in this. They didn't collect his laptop in time, but after he resigned, he still had his laptop and access to all his information, and he started taking documentation. He was literally copying out whole folders regardless of whether there was client information in there or what. He didn't care. He was just like downloading everything. But it was a lesson learned for the company. They needed a better joiners, leavers, movers process
Yeah.
to make sure they disabled accounts on the day, but also to enable logging was enabled, because thankfully in this case we had logging enabled. We could see him connecting in and downloading files, so we could attribute that to him. It was coming from his device. We had his user logon that was connecting in, and we saw the downloads happening.
Yeah.
So there was good and bad lessons learned from that incident.
Yeah, I think if there's one summary from everything so far, it's switch on your logs. Like that can be quite useful.
See, yes and no.
Yeah, you don't want
So-
to get drowned in it, but
Yes, you can
need
get
something.
drowned in logs. That's a huge problem for people. You turn up, you end up logging too much, and it's a cost. Wherever you're storing those logs, it can be expensive, especially if you're using a cloud service. Microsoft charge you for everything. So the more logs you have coming in, if you're not filtering them, but then when you start filtering things, you may lose something. So it's a balancing act, making sure you cover the majority of things. But yeah, that then creates a chance that you may miss something. That's why it goes back to your definition. As just because you have cybersecurity practices in place doesn't mean you will catch everything. And we haven't even touched on new vulnerabilities that can't be detected.
Known as a 0 day,
No.
as have we heard once or twice, an O day. I remember sitting on a call, but what the heck are you talking about?
Yeah, that call, I remember this was many, many years ago when T and I worked together, but somebody was saying O day, and I remember thinking, what's this guy talking about? What's he saying? And
What's this new thing that we haven't heard of?
I've not heard this before. And then when he elaborated and we got the context, he's talking about a 0 day. It almost reminds me of phising.
Oh, yeah.
And that, I think, leads us perfectly onto the next series that we'll be doing, and we can explain the phising.
Yeah.
So we'll be going into some more threats to small business, giving you some real examples of incidents, and more importantly, diving into, we mentioned user training as the first thing. So I think the first thing that we start off with is phishing. And that leads us onto the story about phising. T once did an interview for was it for a security engineer?
Oh, yeah. I did some really great interviews. I got a lot of good stories.
We'll definitely recall a couple of those over the lifetime of this podcast. But yeah, in this scenario, the interviewee was doing a presentation and kept referring to phishing as phising for the whole thing. The entire length of the interview, which was is a 10-minute presentation he did?
Yeah.
And it was phising throughout. And then questions afterwards, if he mentioned the word phishing, it was just phising. So yeah, that was another thing that became phising for us. Another in-joke that you lot can all now join in.
But yeah, thank you again for joining us for another episode of the CyberPod.
I've been Kash.
I've been Tarek. It's been good to see you, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you.